However, there are some cons to oralism. First and foremost, you are simply working against the grain when it comes to language. By nature, all deaf individuals are visual learners, and therefore sign language is a natural way to communicate. Students have to work much harder to talk and listen than if they were given access to sign language. If a student is unsuccessful at learning speech and listening in their critical period of language development and are not exposed to sign, the ability to grasp and understand language may be weakened. Secondly, oral students rely heavily on lip reading, which can be tiresome and inaccurate. For instance, the letter M and P look the exact same on the mouth, so communication can sometimes be lost. Finally, many believe that the student's content exposure in the classroom is sacrificed because so much education time and energy is spent on speech and listening. The second approach to deaf education is manual communication. Students are taught sign language at a young age and are either taught at a deaf school with deaf teachers or are given interpreters in a mainstream classroom. Just like oralism, manual communication also has its pros and cons. Some pros include the student's exposure to the natural language. Energy is not spent on speech and can therefore be spent more heavily on class content. And lastly, students rely on sign, not lip reading, to understand what is being said. There are several cons. The most common criticism of manual communication is the inability to communicate with the hearing world effectively. This can be a huge source of frustration and isolation for deaf individuals who rely on sign language. This also means that these individuals have a greater reliance on interpreters for education, job interviews, church services, and more. Finally, because sign language is their first language, English can also suffer, leading to poor reading and writing skills. If you have a deaf student in your class, you may notice that they have difficulty keeping up with lectures or any other classroom communication. They may be easily distracted by visual stimulation and have difficulty with reading, grammar, spelling, and writing. You may also notice that students who use interpreters are often the last to respond. This is not because the student is slow, but simply because the interpreter has to be several seconds behind what is being said in order to communicate the concepts effectively. Deaf students also may be reluctant to use their voice for fear of embarrassment and are sometimes isolated and victims of bullying. In order to help your deaf students, you should hold high standards for your student, call on them for answers, face the student as much as possible, especially if they are oral and rely on lip reading. Use visuals such as posters, PowerPoints, and models to help understanding. Make sure all videos are closed captioned. Provide students with notes if possible. Make sure the deaf student's vision of the board is not blocked. Give lesson plans and materials to the interpreter ahead of time so they can prepare their concept choices for the lecture. And finally, if your student signs, it never hurts to learn just a few signs to use with them in the class. Knowing how to say, "How are you?" for instance, can really help them feel important and included. Alright class, almost done. Let's take a final look into my visit at the Moog Center for Deaf Education. Because this is an oral school, there are many ways the classroom I observed looked just like a regular class. For instance, the classroom had a very standard routine and activities planned for the kids. The students were talking to one another, listening to their teacher, and at one point even listening to music. However, there were definitely some differences. First, the students were purposely positioned in a ring shape so that no one's vision was blocked. Also, throughout the class, students took turns leaving the classroom to go to speech therapy. Several times, the teacher would whisper to the students to really encourage the students to listen closely. But sometimes the students were a little lost and confused, and I was sensing that there was some communication breakdown. Assistive technology was used by the teachers such as FM systems, microphones, and speakers, and every student but one either had a hearing aid or cochlear implant. Finally, our class is replaced by theater to promote language and social skills. The end. Thanks for listening.
Created using Powtoon.